Hi everyone. Thanks for coming back today, joining us for another Green Living seminar. I'm Dr. Elena Traister in the Environmental Studies Department here at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. This semester's Green Living seminars focus on the theme Nature and Spirituality. They take place every Wednesday at 5:30 here in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation, room 121. If you'd like to see the schedule of upcoming presentations, you can see that on our website at www.mcla.edu/greenliving. Our presentation will last 45 minutes or so with an opportunity to ask questions at the end, so please do remember your questions so that you can ask them during the Q&A. And before I introduce our speaker, I want to make a quick announcement to encourage you to come back again next week. On Wednesday, February 11th, educator and naturalist Dave Edson will join us with a talk titled Mindful Birding and the Science of Awe, Improving Our Health and Saving the Planet. So come back then. Today, we're thrilled to have with us Dr. Nimah Mazaheri. His presentation is titled Faith Under Fire, How Religion Shapes Climate Concern in the Middle East. He is a professor of political science and dean of academic affairs at Tufts University. His research centers on topics relating to energy, environmentalism, and economic development in the global south. He's the author of the books Hydrocarbon Citizens, How Oil Transformed People and Politics in the Middle East, and Oil Booms and Business Busts, Why Resource Wealth Hurts Entrepreneurs in the Developing World. He worked at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. before joining the faculty at Tufts University. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much. The Middle East is one of the most environmentally vulnerable regions on Earth today. And yet, it's one that is often missing from global conversations about climate, sustainability, and environmental ethics. When people think of the Middle East, they tend to focus on politics, conflict, religion, or oil. But beneath what we see in all the news headlines lies a quieter, more fundamental crisis that has been going on for centuries. And that is the struggle to sustain life itself in an increasingly fragile ecological landscape. Water scarcity alone tells a very stark story. The Middle East is the most water-stressed region of the world. Roughly 80% of the population lives under extremely high water stress. And the 5 most water-stressed countries on Earth are all located in this region. In practical terms, this means that millions of people live with constant uncertainty about whether clean water will be available today, next week, or next year. Rivers are shrinking, aquifers are being depleted faster than they can recharge, and desalinization, while technologically impressive, is energy intensive, expensive, and environmentally damaging in its own right. Water scarcity is inseparable from water contamination. In countries like Iraq and Egypt, millions of people rely on water that is unsafe for human consumption. Polluted rivers, aging infrastructure, and untreated sewage expose communities to constant health risks. We know that unsafe water has caused malnutrition in Yemen and outbreaks of diseases like polio. And these are living conditions that many people assume belong to the past, but in fact they remain very real in the present. Then there's the air. The average urban resident in the Middle East breathes air that is 10 times more polluted than the level considered safe by the World Health Organization. And this is not only a problem of poverty. Some of the worst air quality in the world is found in wealthy countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Bahrain. Vehicle emissions, industrial pollution, and fossil fuel dependence all combine to create air quality that quietly shortens lives, strains health systems, and deepens inequality. Waste adds another layer to this crisis. Across much of the region, garbage is overflowing. Sanitation experts describe waste systems as struggling to cope with tremendously increasing levels of trash. Plastic waste is especially alarming. The Middle East has the highest per capita plastic footprint of any region in the world. And these are only the current conditions in the region today. Climate change threatens to intensify all of them. Extreme heat waves are becoming longer and more deadly. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities and agricultural land. Droughts and floods are becoming more frequent and more severe. According to research from the Brookings Institution, climate change has the potential to devastate large parts of the Middle East and North Africa. This matters not only environmentally, but socially and politically. Climate-related shocks are linked to increased risks of violence, forced migration, food and water conflict, and economic decline. And this is happening in a place where roughly 40% of the population already lives in poverty, and where many societies are grappling with conflict, political instability, and weak infrastructure. Climate stress does not create these problems, but we know that it magnifies them. So now that I've presented these environmental realities, I'd like to pause, because I know what many of you are probably thinking. You're probably thinking, how could countries facing war, violence, and chronic instability possibly tackle these environmental crises? How could countries lacking democracy, transparency, and with widespread corruption actually implement lasting solutions to any of these problems? How could ordinary people navigating daily uncertainty, shortages, and fear find the space to make meaningful choices for the environment? And to be clear, these are not the wrong questions to ask. People's daily realities matter, conflict matters, governance matters, political systems affect environmental outcomes. No one would deny that all of these shape what is possible when it comes to the environment. But here's where the conversation usually takes a turn that feels obvious and yet may be misleading. At this point, a familiar assumption often emerges, which is that addressing these environmental challenges and doing so effectively and consistently over time surely requires a very different kind of government than what we see today in most of the Middle East. It requires a government that endorses democracy. It requires one that endorses liberal values, scientific literacy, and civic participation. And that assumption feels intuitive. Because if we look around the world, we see that pro-environmental policy and environmental movements themselves are often linked to democratic ideals, to grassroots activism, and an assumed liberal-minded concern for the global common. But what if that story is incomplete? What if some of the most environmentally responsible and future-oriented behaviors are not coming from democratic governments or democratic values at all, but are coming from places that we least expect? And this is where my work begins. So I study public opinion using large-scale surveys, which are tools that allow us to see how tens of thousands of ordinary people think about politics, religion, morality, and everyday life. Surveys don't just tell us what people do, they help us understand why they do it. They allow us to connect behavior like recycling or buying an electric vehicle or other acts of environmentalism to deeper systems of belief, your level of trust in the government, your moral values, your religious commitments, your political attitudes. Surveys are never perfect, we all know that. They can't capture every nuance of people's lives or what they think, but they do offer a powerful window into attitudes, behaviors, and the overall patterns of their belief system. And when we look closely at survey data from across the Middle East and North Africa, a striking and deeply counterintuitive pattern emerges. In the midst of one of the world's most severe environmental crises, it is often the people most skeptical of democracy, those who trust strong autocratic leaders, those who value stability over political freedoms, and those who support religious authority, who are the most likely to engage in everyday acts of environmental stewardship. And they are more likely than their liberal and their democratic-minded neighbors to say that they are doing so specifically to protect the environment. Now, this challenges many of our assumptions about politics and sustainability and human behavior. But how and why does this happen? How is it that autocracy and social control and religious government somehow create this unexpected pathway to environmentalism? Well, to explain this finding, which I'll unpack a little more later, what I want to do first is share with you a theory that I've developed. Now, as I alluded to, most of us carry this mental map of how environmentalism works. On one side of that map, you have democracy, liberal values, civic participation, scientific awareness. And on the other side, you have authoritarianism, political repression, obedience to authority, and limited individual freedoms. An environmental concern, we assume, belongs firmly on the democratic side of the ledger. And that assumption is not unreasonable. Many environmental movements have grown out of democratic activism. We associate sustainability with public debate and grassroots organizing and citizens putting pressure on their governments. And in many places, that story is true. But when we look closely at stories and evidence of everyday environmental behavior in many parts of the Middle East and North Africa, that map starts to break down. And instead, we see environmentalism not always as a form of protest, not as a form of civic resistance, and not rooted primarily in an understanding of climate science or liberal ideology. Instead, we see a lot of environmental behavior grounded in moral duty, obedience, frugality, and ethical norms, which are all values that are often cultivated and reinforced by authoritarian governments. I describe this phenomenon as green authoritarianism, which are situations in which environmentally sustainable behavior is produced not despite authoritarian values, but through authoritarian values. And this idea is unsettling because it forces us to confront a difficult possibility, which is that sustainability can flourish under political systems we usually assume are hostile to ethical citizenship. So here's the idea. Green authoritarianism is built on three interlocking forces. The first of these forces is moralized authority. Basically, leaders framing doing the right thing as a duty or virtue. Second is anti-Western sentiment, which encourages the limiting of consumption as a fight against consumerism. And the third is the internalization of frugality as a virtue, the idea that conserving and reusing and minimizing waste is not just a rule to follow, but is a personal ethic. And together, I argue that these mechanisms create surprising pathways for environmentally sustainable behaviors to take root and even flourish under autocratic political systems. Now let me unpack each of these forces one at a time, because I think the story that they tell flips many assumptions that we have about politics and sustainability on their head. The first component is moralized authority. And there's a common misperception about authoritarian systems, which is that they just force people to do what they want by threatening violence. Yes, they do that. They do that in many contexts. But they do not rely on the threat of violence alone. They also work by framing obedience, restraint, and discipline as ethical values. The authoritarian leaders who are effective do not portray themselves as merely administrators. They are also moral figures who articulate visions of the good life, the good citizen, and the responsible household. And in many authoritarian or semi-authoritarian contexts, environmental messages are folded into broader moral narratives. And it becomes the idea that conserving resources is patriotic. Wasting is sinful. Excess is shameful. Environmental behavior becomes less about personal preference or scientific reasoning and more about being a good person. A country like Iran offers a very clear example of this. In Iran, there's a lot of rhetoric about conservation. And there, it's often framed through an Islamic lens. But ideas of moderation and stewardship and moral restraint are everywhere in this rhetoric about conservation. In the minds of the leaders of the country, wastefulness is not something that's simply inefficient, it's morally wrong. Reusing products, limiting consumption, and avoiding excess are virtuous acts. And importantly, this kind of framing does not require citizens to understand climate science. You don't need to understand how recycling works to recycle. You just need to recognize moral authority. And so this moralization of authority transforms environmental behavior from something that we often think of in the West as a technical problem into something that is more of an ethical obligation. And this is really powerful because once environmentalism is embedded as a moral duty, it becomes resilient. And resilient even when political freedoms are restricted. The second component of my theory of green authoritarians lies in how the spread of anti-Western ideology can, perhaps surprisingly, promote environmentally sustainable behaviors. This is often expressed through popular opposition to consumer culture and global capitalism, phenomena widely perceived as invented, exported, and normalized by the West. Although there's evidence that some of these attitudes are shifting, particularly in urban centers in the Middle East and among younger populations, a persistent feature of many of these contexts is a public denunciation of materialism and the lavish lifestyles of national elites who are often portrayed as culturally alienated and Western educated. And in the Middle East, this type of discourse has very deep roots. Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt in the 50s and 60s, routinely condemned the decadence of the West while advancing a vision of Arab nationalism that was grounded in dignity, self-reliance, and restraint. If you look at the origins of modern Islamic politics, you'll find similar portrayals. Western society is a place that's morally hollow. They're obsessed with material accumulation. They're spiritually ungrounded. In Iran, supporters of the revolution in 1979 spoke out against people becoming intoxicated by the West, and they decried the monarchy's cultural dependence on Western consumption, Western aesthetics, Western values. And I believe that the internalization of these anti-Western attitudes can shape everyday consumption practices. Citizens might abstain from purchasing luxury goods. They might boycott Western-made products in favor of domestic alternatives. They might go to local shopkeepers instead of going to Western-style malls and retail chains. Or they might adopt a broader anti-materialist ethic. It's true that not all of these behaviors are environmentally friendly. That's obvious. But I argue that a conscious rejection of consumerism will reduce reliance on many of the everyday household products that are associated with Western convenience culture, many of which are single-use, many of which are plastic-dependent. Plastic bottled water is a very telling example. Across much of the Middle East, bottled water is widely associated, the purchase of bottled water is widely associated with wealth, higher social status, and a Western-influenced preference for convenience over necessity. A study was done in Iran which found that perceptions of status were a stronger motivator for purchasing bottled water than actual concerns about water safety. So in this context, rejecting bottled water and reusing containers or relying on household storage, all of these function not simply as a practical or economic choice, but as a moral and cultural statement. The third component of my theory is the encouragement of frugality among authoritarian leaders. Now, many authoritarian countries are obviously economically constrained, and so we know that scarcity forces people to reuse, to repair, and to conserve. But what many authoritarian systems also do particularly well is they transform necessity into virtue. Cuba is a powerful example of this. In Cuba, the decades of economic isolation and material scarcity have made reuse unavoidable. People in Cuba repair appliances, they repurpose containers, they extend the life of everyday objects far beyond what is typical in consumer societies. And so over time, these types of practices become moralized. Frugality is not something that is just practical, it's considered honorable. And so when people are consuming with excess, that's viewed with suspicion. Waste is something that's socially frowned upon. And Iran, again, is another good example of this. For decades, leaders have promoted frugality not just as good economics, but as a duty. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has this concept of a resistance economy, which frames avoiding waste and consuming modestly as patriotic and virtuous acts. State messaging in Iran also emphasizes that luxury and excess are socially undesirable, while everyday restraint, whether that's saving water or electricity or your materials, that's a way of living ethically and serving the nation. So taken together, these three components, moralized authority, anti-Western sentiment, and virtuous frugality, form the core of what I'm calling green authoritarianism. And this is what's so unique. Did I say green authoritarianism? Yeah, that's what I said, right? Green authoritarianism. Okay. And this is what's so unique about this particular type of environmentalism. It's top-down rather than grassroots. Environmental behaviors are shaped by rules, by leadership, and by authority. They're not seen as things that are spontaneously emerging from communities. It's also moral rather than scientific. So people in the Middle East are acting because they feel that it's the right thing to do, not because they understand climate modeling or the data. It's also more of a habit than something that you do deliberately. These actions are something that are repeated automatically as part of your daily life. It's not something that you're choosing to do after careful deliberation and reflection on the impact. It's also something that's collective rather than expressive. Sustainable behaviors are practiced for the good of society. It's not something that you're doing to signal personal identity or your values or your politics. It's just something that everybody does. So as I've suggested, there are elements of this theory that make one uncomfortable, because we are used to thinking of environmentalism as a signal of progressive politics, of scientific knowledge, and of democratic engagement. But green authoritarianism suggests something more troubling, which is that sustainability can be produced through obedience, through hierarchy, and through morality, just as effectively as it is through freedom and participation, at least at the level of everyday behavior. And if this phenomenon is indeed present throughout the world, I believe it forces us to rethink what environmental action really is. Is it an expression of autonomy, or is it a reflection of moral order? Is sustainability about choice, or is it about meaning? And the answer that I argue is that it can be both. But unless we understand how different systems produce environmental behavior, we risk misunderstanding why people act the way they do. We also fail to appreciate how fragile those actions may be when a person or a nation's political or moral frameworks shift. Now, let me just kind of briefly unpack some of the survey findings that I've alluded to. Is this real? Is this a measurable pattern? So the findings that I'm presenting come from the Arab Barometer, which is one of the most comprehensive public opinion surveys in the Middle East and North Africa. Across multiple waves, the Arab Barometer has interviewed tens of thousands of individuals in countries that include Egypt, Iraq, Kuwait, Morocco, Tunisia, and many others. 14 or 15 countries in total. And these surveys are nationally representative, and they capture not only political attitudes, but also everyday behaviors. You know, how people live, how they conserve, how they make decisions inside their homes. One particularly revealing question asks respondents how often they reuse plastic or glass bottles at home. For example, by filling them with water and putting them in the fridge, which is a very common practice. This may seem like, you know, kind of a small and mundane behavior, but that's actually why it matters a lot. Because reuse does not always involve like formal recycling systems or political activism or policy compliance, but it often reflects these ordinary, habitual actions. So they ask people, do you reuse your plastic or glass water bottles and put them in the fridge? And then they ask them why. Why do you do this? And they can say that they do it to save money. They can do it for convenience, that they do it because of convenience, or they do it because they believe that it protects the environment. So they're given these options to, you know, justify why they do this. And this allows us to distinguish between behavior that is driven by necessity, right, to save money, or behavior that is driven by moral or environmental reasoning, that they do it to protect the environment. And when we connect these reuse behaviors to political attitudes, a very striking and counterintuitive pattern emerges. Across countries and survey waves, people in the Middle East and North Africa who express higher levels of trust in the government, who support leaders who bend the rules to solve problems, and who believe that political stability is more important than having democracy, are all more likely to reuse bottles than respondents who say that they strongly favor democracy and they want liberal politics. And this relationship holds even after accounting for someone's level of income, their level of education, their gender, their age, whether or not you live in an urban or rural area. And even more surprising is how people explain their behavior. Among those who reuse bottles, respondents with authoritarian sympathies are significantly more likely to say that they do so specifically to protect the environment. In other words, they're not just reusing out of economic necessity or a lack of alternatives. They interpret their actions as environmentally meaningful. So these findings directly challenge a common assumption in environmental politics, which is that sustainability is primarily driven by liberal values or democratic engagement or environmental consciousness as we typically understand it. In the Arab Barometer data, those factors matter far less than moral alignment with authority, order, and collective norms. At the same time, it's important to be clear about what these findings do not show. Most people who reuse bottles in the region do so for practical reasons: cost savings, convenience, or scarcity. Environmental motivation is not the dominant explanation overall. But what makes the findings striking is who is most likely to invoke environmental protection when they do reuse. And that group is disproportionately composed of people who trust authority and they accept non-democratic states. So this distinction between behavior and motivation is central. Two people may engage in the same environmentally friendly act, but do so for radically different reasons. One may act out of economic necessity, another may act out of moral obligation, and a third may act because their behavior aligns with the societal expectations that are promoted by the state. The environmental outcome is the same, but the ethical logic behind it is not. And I think this is where green authoritarianism becomes visible. In parts of the Middle East and North Africa, everyday conservation is often embedded with moral narratives that emphasize frugality and obedience and social responsibility. These narratives are all reinforced by governments, schools, and public statements that frame conservation as a civic duty rather than a political choice. And the result is a pattern that unsettles our conventional environmental wisdom, which is that people who are skeptical of democracy may nonetheless be reliable practitioners of everyday sustainability. Now, if these findings are correct, and they are remarkably consistent, you'll just have to take my word on it, then environmental behavior cannot be understood simply as a byproduct of liberal democracy or environmental ideology. Sustainability clearly can emerge from political contexts that many observers assume are hostile to ethical or collective action. And authority, when coupled with moral framing, can motivate people to act in environmentally responsible ways, even in the absence of democratic participation. I want to be clear, because this does not mean that authoritarianism is desirable. It does not mean that repression produces environmental justice, or that environmental gains justify political constraints. But it does mean that environmental action is sometimes driven less by political labels and more by moral meaning. So the findings that I just described, I think raise a deeper question, and one that takes us beyond politics alone. And that's that if people can engage in environmental stewardship without liberal values, without democratic participation, and even without explicit concern or knowledge of climate science, then what is doing the moral work underneath these behaviors? What gives everyday acts of conservation their meaning? And politics is part of the answer, but it's not the whole story. Across much of the Middle East and North Africa, political authority does not operate in isolation from moral authority. Political norms are deeply entangled with ethical traditions, religious teachings, and ideas about conduct that is right. Trust in authority often overlaps with trust in moral systems that have long predated modern states. And this overlap matters enormously for how people interpret environmental responsibility. So this realization led to a second line of research, one that shifts the focus from governments and regimes to more religion and climate science, which I think some of you read the article maybe. Because I started to think that if environmental behavior can be shaped by moral obligation rather than ideology, then religion, which is one of the most powerful moral frameworks in the world, should play a central role in shaping how people understand climate change and environmental risk and human responsibility toward nature. But in my research, here too I encountered a paradox. Religion is often portrayed as an obstacle to climate science, associated with skepticism or fatalism or resistance to expert knowledge. At the same time, we know that religious traditions around the world contain some of the strongest moral language about stewardship and restraint and humility and care for creation. So which is it? Does religion undermine support for climate science, or does it motivate it? Does faith discourage environmental action, or does it provide the ethical foundation that makes action meaningful? Similar to my research on green authoritarianism, the answer turns out to be, well, it depends. It depends not on belief itself, but it depends on moral interpretation. So the core theory of my work on faith and climate is simple. Religion does not have a uniform effect on environmental attitudes. Instead, I argue that its influence depends on how religious individuals understand moral responsibility and human agency and the relationships that humans have with the natural world. At the heart of this theory are three mechanisms. The first is moral framing. Religious traditions provide moral narratives that tell people what kinds of actions are virtuous, obligatory, or sinful. When environmental protection is framed as stewardship, as caring for creation, avoiding waste, protecting what's sacred, then religion can strongly motivate concern for climate change and support for scientific explanations. Climate science becomes a tool for fulfilling moral duty, not a threat to one's belief. The second component is the agency versus fatalism idea. Some religious interpretations emphasize human responsibility and accountability. Others emphasize divine control. When people believe that humans are morally responsible for the state of the world, they are more likely to accept climate science and see environmental degradation as something that humans can and must address. But when people believe their outcomes are entirely in the hands of a deity, then climate change may appear morally irrelevant or beyond human influence. The third important component is what we call boundary making. Religion can blur or sharpen perceived boundaries between sacred truth and scientific knowledge. When science is seen as compatible with faith, religious individuals are more open to climate science. When science is framed as competing with faith, it provokes resistance. So, importantly, my theory rejects the idea that religiosity itself is what matters. The key variable is not how religious someone is, but how they reason morally through their faith. Religion can amplify environmental concern, or they can suppress them, and it depends on which ethical narratives are activated. So to evaluate how religion shapes attitudes toward climate science, I again turn to survey data, and in particular the Arab Barometer, which is this same high-quality cross-national data set that underpins my green authoritarianism findings. So respondents were asked how serious they believe climate change is, along with detailed questions about religion, politics, demographics, and daily life. And some results look familiar with what we see in other contexts around the world. The more educated you are, the more concerned you are about climate change. Age also matters in a way that kind of was surprising. Older individuals in the Middle East are more concerned about climate change than younger ones. Urban residents, by contrast, does not reliably predict concern, and income is actually negatively related. People who feel economically better off tend to be less worried about climate change. But the most striking finding involves religion. First, Christians in the Middle East are more than twice as likely as Muslims to say climate change is a very serious problem. And that's even after accounting for differences with countries and education and age and income and so on. And this is not what we would expect if we assume that climate concern simply follows global religious hierarchies or Western patterns. But this is a robust and consistent result. Second, and even more counterintuitively, religiosity itself is a positive predictor of climate change concern. Religious people, regardless of whether they are Muslim or Christian, are significantly more likely to be worried about climate change than those who describe themselves as non-religious. And this directly contrasts with findings from places like the United States, where religiosity, especially among some Christian groups, is often associated with climate skepticism. Where things get especially interesting is when we look within religious groups. For Christians in the Middle East, religiosity increases their concern about climate change, but attitudes towards religious government do not seem to matter. A devout Christian who supports religious politics in the region looks no different environmentally from one who does not. But among Muslims, we see a divide in their politics. Religiosity alone increases concern, we established that, but religiosity combined with support for Islamic government actually reduces their concern about climate change. And this pattern closely resembles what we see in the United States among evangelical Christians. Faith intensifies environmental concern unless it is fueled with a particular political identity. So this points to a deeper implication. What we are seeing is not simply religion versus science or faith versus reason. We are seeing what I think is the beginning of a culture war over climate change in the Middle East, and one that is shaped by identity and power and politics. Climate concern becomes a signal of moral alignment, not just scientific understanding. So taken together, these findings challenge a core assumption, which is that religion in the Middle East is an obstacle to environmental awareness. In fact, for most people, faith heightens their concern about climate change, unless it becomes entangled in politics, which then frames environmentalism as something that's foreign or threatening or ideologically suspect. And that tension between faith as a moral responsibility and faith as a political identity is, I think, one of the most important findings that work has. So let me close with a thought that might feel unsettling, but also I think it's hopeful in some ways. If there's one lesson that runs through the work that I've done recently, it's that, one thing that I've learned, it's that people do not act sustainably because they have like the right politics or the right beliefs or even the right information. They act when environmental care fits into the moral story that already makes sense to them. In the Middle East and North Africa, that moral story sometimes runs through trust in authority. Sometimes it runs through frugality. Sometimes it runs through faith. Sometimes it runs through necessity. And sometimes it runs through all of them at once. What surprised me most is not that people disagree about climate change or environmental responsibility, but it's that very different moral frameworks can lead to the same concrete acts of environmental stewardship. A reused water bottle, water conserved during a shortage, waste that's not thrown away, land that's treated with restraint rather than entitlement. These are all small acts, but small acts are where ethics live. At the same time, the research also shows us something more challenging. Environmentalism is not immune to polarization. Just as we see culture wars around climate change in the US, similar moral divisions are emerging quietly elsewhere about who has authority over nature, whether humans should intervene, and what responsibility really means. And if we ignore those moral tensions, no amount of data or technology will be able to carry us far. But here is where I think is also the optimistic part. This research suggests that there is no single gatekeeper to environmental responsibility. Democracy is not the only path. Science is not the only language. Secularism is not the only moral foundation. Faith, authority, culture, and ethics, all of these can motivate care for the environment when they are taken seriously rather than dismissed. For those of us who are concerned with fostering healthier relationships between humans and nature, I think this should change how we think about solutions. The question is not, how do we get everyone to think like us? A better question is, how do we get people to act ethically within the moral worlds that they already inhabit? So I want to leave you with a final personal question, not as a researcher, but as a fellow inhabitant of this very fragile planet. When you exercise care for the natural world, what story are you telling yourself about why it matters? Are you telling yourself a story about responsibility, about obedience, about stewardship, or justice, or faith? Whatever your answer is, my hope is that today has shown you that there is more than one way to arrive at care. And if we can learn to recognize and respect and work with that diversity rather than fighting it, then we're far better equipped to protect places and landscapes and futures that we depend on. Thank you.